Follow along, Catholic Pilgrims, as we follow French Doctor of the Church, St. Francis de Sales, through his book, Introduction to the Devout Life. Tune in as we read through this practical guide for living out the Catholic faith well. Welcome back, Catholic Pilgrims, to the last reading from the fourth part. If you remember, the fourth part has been all about temptations. And last time we talked about dryness and barrenness in the spiritual life. And there's a real temptation when we feel dryness to think that God has utterly abandoned us and that nothing we do makes any difference. We think this because we don't feel anything. And we like to feel consolations in our relationship with God. And when we do good works, we like to feel full of fire and passion when we do them. However, sometimes we don't, and the temptation is to give up. Today we are going to hear about a person who came into the faith full of zeal, and then the dryness set in. St. Francis is going to give us examples of what to do and what not to do during periods of dryness. So let's open our books to chapter 15 of the fourth part. Chapter 15, an example and illustration. In order to illustrate what I have said, I will give you a passage from the life of St. Bernard, as it is related by a wise and learned writer. It is a common thing for nearly all who are just beginning to serve God and are not as yet accustomed to the withdrawal of His sensible grace or to the vicissitudes of the spiritual life, when they lose the flavor of fervent devotion and the pleasant light which beckons them forward on the path heavenward, to lose courage suddenly and sink into despondency and sadness of heart. And those who are experienced in this say that it is because human nature cannot remain long hungry without any gratification, either heavenly or earthly. And inasmuch as souls raised above themselves by the enjoyment of spiritual delights easily renounce visible objects, when by God's disposal their spiritual joy is taken away, and they, being likewise bare of temporal joys, and not being as yet accustomed patiently to wait the return of their true Son, imagine themselves to be neither in heaven nor on earth, but to be buried in perpetual darkness. Wherefore they languish and groan, becoming burdensome and wearisome above all to themselves. Such was the case during the journey of which I speak, with a member of the company by name Geoffrey de Perron, who was but newly dedicated to the service of God. Geoffrey, becoming suddenly dry and barren of consolation, and absorbed with his inward darkness, began to recur to thoughts of his worldly friends, his relatives, and the worldly goods which he had forsaken. Through such thoughts his temptation grew so strong that he could not hide it, and one of his most intimate companions, perceiving it in his countenance, prudently addressed him with tender words, privately asking, "What is this, Geoffrey? Why art thou contrary to thy wont, thus pensive and sorrowful?" Then he with a heavy sigh made answer, "Alas, my brother, never in my lifetime shall I taste joy again." The other, being moved to pity by his words, with fraternal zeal hastened to inform their common father, St. Bernard, of what had passed. Bernard, perceiving the danger, entered a church hard by in order to pray for him. Meanwhile, Geoffrey, overcome with sadness, reclined his head against a stone and fell asleep. But after a little while both arose, one imbued with the grace of prayer, and the other waking from his slumber with so serene and cheerful a countenance that his friend, marveling at so great and sudden a change, could not refrain from gently reproaching him with the words he had so lately uttered. Whereupon Geoffrey answered, "If then I told thee that I should never be glad, now I assure thee that I shall never be sorrowful." Such was the effect of temptation on this pious man. And I would have you thence observe, number 1, that God generally gives to those who enter His service some foretaste of heavenly joy, in order to lead them from earthly delights and to encourage them in the pursuit of divine love. Number 2, that it is equally this good God who occasionally, in His wisdom, takes from us the milk and honey of consolation, in order that we may learn to eat the dry but solid bread of a vigorous devotion, practiced amidst the trials of disgust and temptation. Number 3, that sometimes fierce temptations arise out of these drynesses and sterilities, and that we must steadily resist these temptations. But the dryness we must bear patiently, since God has appointed it for our trial. Number 4, that we may never lose our courage amidst our inward troubles, nor say with the good Geoffrey, "I shall never be happy." For during the night we should await the day, and even so, amidst the brightest spiritual sunshine, we should never say, "I shall never be sad." But, as the wise man says, "In the day of good things, be not unmindful of evils." Hope amidst trials, and fear amidst prosperity, and in both, always humble yourself. Number 5, that our sovereign remedy is to discover our grief to some spiritual friend who is able to console us. And finally, I would observe that, as in all other things, so here our merciful God and our great enemy have opposite aims. For by these trials God would lead us to get purity of heart, to entire renunciation of our own interests where His service is concerned, and to a perfect setting aside of self. Satan would convert them rather into occasions of discouragement, to make us fall back upon sensual delights, as also to make us wearisome to ourselves and to others, whereby to decry and disgrace the flame of holy devotion. But if you follow the counsels I have given you, you will greatly increase your perfection by the trials you undergo amidst these inward afflictions, of which I would say yet one word more. Sometimes disinclination, dryness, and barrenness of heart proceed from bodily indisposition, as when owing to an excess in watching, fasting, and labor, we are overcome with lassitude, drowsiness, heaviness, and similar infirmities. Although these depend upon the state of the body, still they hinder the mind, the two being so closely linked together. Now, when such is the case, we should strive to perform sundry acts of virtue with the full strength of the mind and will, for although the soul may seem to be slumbering, overpowered with weariness and exhaustion, yet these mental acts are still highly acceptable to God. And at such times we may say with the bride, "I sleep, but my heart waketh." And as I said before, if there is less pleasure in such exertions, there is more merit. But the fitting remedy in such a case is to reinvigorate the body by means of some lawful relaxation and recreation. It was one of St. Francis's rules for his religious that they should always keep their labors within such bounds as never to overwhelm the fervor of their spirit. This holy father himself was once assailed and troubled by so deep a melancholy that he could not conceal it in his exterior deportment. If he wished to converse with his monks, he was unable. If he absented himself from them, it did but make him worse. Abstinence and bodily mortifications overpowered him, and he found no relief in prayer. For 2 years he was in this condition, so that he appeared to be wholly forsaken of God. But at last, after he had endured the heavy storm in all humility, our Savior suddenly restored him to a happy tranquility. Thus God's chosen servants are subject to such trials, and those less worthy should not greatly marvel if they too are tried. What if, for the rest of your life, Mass felt dry and barren? Would you still go? It is part of the human condition that we think that we must always feel utterly amazing when we are doing something good or something we like or should like. And when we don't, well, we think that it's time to move on and abandon ship. Most marriages start out full of butterflies and lovey-dovey eyes, and then as the years move on, the infatuation wears off and real life issues come upon the married couple. Children take time away from being able to focus on just each other, obligations steal time, and before we know it, marriage doesn't feel super fun anymore. And so what happens? People bail. They've lost that love and feeling, and since there is dryness, they think, well, the marriage must be wrong. This happens with the Mass too. I can't tell you how many times people have told me that they don't feel anything at the Mass. And so they leave to go find a place that they feel something. But why is feeling something a necessary component of the spiritual life? It's nowhere in the Bible, and it shouldn't be a necessary component, but it is for a lot of humans because we are often ruled by our emotions. So people leave the Catholic Church to go to another church with music that moves them and that's very fun. But what happens when that wears off? Well, it's time to shop around again. St. Francis says, quote, "It is a common thing for nearly all who are just beginning to serve God and are not as yet accustomed to the withdrawal of His sensible grace or the vicissitudes of the spiritual life, when they lose the flavor of fervent devotion and the pleasant light which beckons them forward on the path heavenward, to lose courage suddenly and sink into despondency and sadness of heart." Unquote. We must realize and remember there will be times in our spiritual life when we will feel like we are running on all cylinders, and there will be times when we feel nothing at all. This is just how it goes. And we can't abandon truth or God's church or our faith because of the dry times. We will come out of them. We just have to be patient and allow ourselves to be tried without bailing on God. There will come a day, Catholic pilgrims, if we hold on to our faith, where we will experience nothing but joy and exquisite exhilaration all the time in heaven. We get foretastes of it here, but it is not lasting here on earth, and we just simply cannot expect it to be. That is all for today. Next up, we move into the fifth part, and until then, live the faith boldly and travel well.